Thanks for being here. My name is Seth. I'm one of the pastors here. If you're here because your mom told you, you needed to come to church for Mother's Day, you should just look at the smile on her face right now because she's just really glad that you're here in the room with you. We're in the middle of a series called Christian. I hope this series has been helpful for you, whether you're new to faith or newer to faith, or if you haven't been here before or haven't been for a while or through this series, I'm going to explain a little bit about what we've been talking about because we've been trying to understand what a Christian is and what a Christian isn't. And we've all been a little bit surprised, I think, through this series to discover that the word Christian wasn't used by the Christians to describe themselves in the New Testament. It was a derogatory term that was used against them. It meant one associated with Christ, and people thought that Christ was Jesus' last name. People still think that, right? But they're wrong. Christ means Messiah. It's a title. It's not Jesus' last name. It's not Mary Christ and Joseph Christ had Jesus Christ. So that was something that we learned throughout this series. But what we've been also understanding is that there was a group of people in the first century who were absolutely convinced that Jesus had died. He was crucified on a Roman cross. He came back to life. God brought him back to life, and they followed him. They followed him. And they called themselves what he called them. They called themselves disciples. And the reason why this is important is because Christian is such a vague term. Christian is a term that has been used, it has been reused, it has been defined, it has been redefined. We have Christians on all sides of all political issues, all sides of racial issues, all sides of socio issues. I mean, it's just all over the place. You can be a Christian and pretty much do whatever you want to do. And so we attach Christians to lots of things. But Jesus says, no, you're something different. You are disciples. In fact, he said, and this is a test for you all to see how much you've been paying attention and I guess how good of a teacher I am here. But Jesus says, this is how you'll know that you're my disciples, if you love. Oh, you guys were a little bit more energetic than Greensburg. There were like 3 there. There were like 5 here. So we're going to do it one more time. This is how you'll know that you're my disciples, if you love one another. And here was the caveat, because it wasn't just love however you want to love. It wasn't love how you think the other person needs to receive love. Jesus says you need to love the way I'm defining love for you, the way you've experienced my love, the way that I'm going to be demonstrating my love as I give my life for you. It was a self-sacrificial love. Now, last week, we began unpacking something that the Apostle John taught in his gospel, which is just a biography of Jesus' life. And John helped to explain how Jesus loved. And so I want to take you back there just as a quick refresher in case you forgot or in case you weren't with us. And then this is going to be the launching point of where we're going today. But here's what he says. John says the Word, and when he says the Word, he's talking about Jesus, the Word. He says the Word became flesh. Like Jesus existed from the beginning with God. The Word was with God. The Word was God. Jesus then took on skin and bones. He became a human, and he made his dwelling among us. Like he lived among people. The actual word there is he tented, or he tabernacled among the people, which was a callback to the Old Testament and the tabernacle where people would go to meet with God. And suddenly God isn't in a special location. Like God is in a human body, right? In the flesh. And then John says, we have seen his glory. And when John says we, he's not talking about you and me, we. He's talking about he, we, and the other 11 we, and all the people who knew Jesus, we, but that's not us, we, because we didn't live at that same time. But he says, we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father. And maybe John kind of paused at this point in time as he's trying to figure out, okay, how do I even fully explain this? How do I help people to understand who Jesus was? How do I best even put this into words? Everything that we saw, everything we experienced. He says, Jesus revealed the glory of God, the splendor of God, which was full of, he says, grace and truth. And we all know what grace is, and we all know what truth is, right? I mean, grace says you're forgiven. Truth says, yeah, but you're accountable. Grace says, we're good. Truth says, yeah, but what you're doing actually isn't good. Grace says, you'll get it right next time. Truth says, yeah, but you didn't get it right last time. And depending on your upbringing and depending on your family, it's possible that you had a family that was a mix of both, right? Sometimes that's the case. Sometimes mom is grace, typically mom's grace, not always, but usually, and dad's Mr. Ungrace. He's the truth side of things. But it's also possible you grew up in maybe a single parent household or where both parents were aligned on one, and maybe it was just all grace all the time. Which is why now that you're older, people are like, you need some boundaries, like you need to have some accountability for your life because, there's a little too much grace there. Or it's possible you grew up in a home that was just all truth, and it was truth, and the truth was pounded into you, and now you're kind of like, why can't you get your act together? And people are like, why don't you be a little more patient with others, right? Because you need a little bit more of this. Our families were a mixed bag, probably. But what John tells us is that Jesus, he wasn't a mixed bag. He was actually full of both. It wasn't grace at the expense of truth, and it certainly wasn't truth at the expense of grace. It was both together to the brim. You didn't take truth out, and you didn't take grace out. He was full. And so John, he went on to say something that should shape our thinking. Here's what he said. He said, the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth, that came through Jesus. Which means if we're going to follow Jesus and if we're going to be his disciples, we can't be grace and we can't be truth. We need to be, to the best of our ability, the embodiment of both. We can't have one at the expense of the other. Some churches are all grace, and all you hear is grace, 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 and it's wonderful when you first go there, but after a while you're like, maybe there needs to be some truth spoken here, right? And some churches are just truth, 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 and you think, yeah, but the reality is we all need grace. We all need grace, and so you can't have one without the other. We need to be both disciples who are embodying each, both together, and if we're to be a church, we should be a church that has both grace and truth. And so last week we talked about how some stories where Jesus embodied both of these, and we shared those different stories with you. There's a woman at the well. There's a woman who's caught in the midst of adultery and thrown down at Jesus' feet. There's Matthew, the tax collector. Oh, the awful tax collectors. There's the thief next to Jesus on the cross. And so we used some caricatured pictures, some images, some stories of how Jesus displayed grace and truth. But today, we're actually going to look at one of Jesus' teachings on grace and truth to help really understand this. And I hope that this is helpful, but I will warn you, it may be a little bit challenging, which means you might have to put on your big boy pants, your big girl pants, right, to embrace what Jesus is going to talk about. And it may require you to confront traditional Christian American theology and the things that we teach and the things that we understand about God. And it may make you squirm a little bit, and if it does, my invitation to you would be go back, open up the scriptures yourself, read it for yourself, and if you come to a different conclusion, let's sit down and talk through it because I would love to have a conversation about what you see, what God is teaching differently. But what's fascinating is that Jesus, he constantly found himself around two very different groups of people. One group was alienated from God. Like they believed God wanted nothing to do with them. In fact, they're so far from God. God would never, he could never, approve of them, right? And then the other group of people, they're convinced that they were approved by God. Like that good housekeeping seal of approval, right? You got God's seal of approval. And they know it, and they're proud of it, and they can't figure out how other people can't really figure it out. The alienated people, they just kind of feel like there's no hope. So why bother? Because we're so far from what God would want us to be, there's no purpose in it. But the thing is that both groups actually misunderstood God. That it's not the approval or disapproval that ultimately matters when it comes to God. There's something far more important. And as Jesus, as he begins addressing these two groups, what he has to do is to address the really bad theology that exists on both sides. And so the question, it's kind of the question that those of you in the room who are parents understand, and that's, how do you help your kids understand something that they can't seem to grasp? And that's what Jesus was trying to do. How do I help people understand the fullness of grace and truth? What does it look like to be full of both at the expense of neither? And so Jesus, he decided to tell a story, a masterfully crafted story. And this story, it left everyone kind of gasping for air, struggling how to go forward. And so I think actually that if we were to really understand this story, because in his first century audience, people were so perplexed by this, that if we don't walk away from this, at least feeling the wind knocked out of us a little bit, it's possible we have not grasped the significance of everything that Jesus was saying. Now, because this is one of the most famous stories that Jesus has ever told, there's a sense that if you grew up in church, or maybe if you've been even a little affiliated with church, you certainly have heard this story before. But what I want to invite you to do is take a step back and try and experience it for the first time the way that people in Jesus' crowd were experiencing it for the first time. So here's what Luke tells us, Luke chapter 15, as the story begins to unfold. He says, "Now the tax collectors and the sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus." Now don't let that just kind of fall over you and forget about it. The tax collectors, that was a big deal. These are tax farmers. You know about the multi-level marketing folks where you hire somebody who hires somebody who hires somebody who hires somebody, and you're all selling something. And it's really the person at the top who makes the big bank. You know what I'm talking about? Right? And so that's what these tax collectors were. They're the ones driving the tricked out SUVs. They're the ones who are getting it done, right? I mean, they're kind of in Rome's pocket, okay? So they're allowed to charge whatever they want for taxes as long as Rome gets their money, as they keep Rome happy, even at the expense of their own countrymen. They were so bad that they had their own category. The general sinners didn't want to be lumped in with them. So you've got sinners and then you've got tax collectors. There are always levels. I'm bad, but I'm not that bad. He's worse, right? And so these are all sinners. These are all people who knew that God isn't happy with them. Now here's what's kind of funny. Again, we know this story so well, we just race past things. But consider the fact that tax collectors and sinners are gathering to hear Jesus. I mean, can you just imagine if our front 3 rows here were filled with the most notorious, terrible people in our communities? And they're sitting here and they're coming to hear a nice sermon. Can you imagine? I mean, most churches don't have that. In fact, you tend to look at those people and say, I'm not sure this is the right place for you, right? What are you doing here? And yet as Jesus is telling this story, his audience, the front row people, are these sinners, these tax collectors. So the other group is sitting in the back row. It's the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. He says, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they muttered, kind of grumbled under their breath. This man welcomes sinners, and he eats with them. And what they weren't saying is Jesus takes these people to restaurants or they hang out and have coffee together, because that didn't really happen in that day. What he's saying is he goes into their homes. He has what was called table fellowship with people, which was seemingly an indication of approval. Table fellowship was approval. And Jesus didn't seem to speak out against these people, so they assumed that he must approve of them. Now, we know what happens when we assume things. We know it's never really a good thing. And so there's some assumptions going on. And these people are wondering, why do the tax collectors and sinners like Jesus? And why does Jesus seem to like them back? Now, there's something going on here, too, that you may not know about or you've maybe never thought about, but Jesus actually has more in common with the Pharisees and the teachers of the law than he does with anyone else in this time period. The Pharisees were actually a smaller religious sect within Judaism, and the reason we know so much about the Pharisees in the New Testament is because so many of them came to faith because they were really aligned with Jesus in many ways. And so these are the people who are like Jesus. They have the most in common with Jesus. And they're thinking to themselves, why are these people attracted to Jesus like bugs on a porch light? I mean, is he condoning their behavior? Does he ever speak out against the tax collecting and call out the tax collectors for taking advantage of people? Does he ever tell the people who are having adultery, you're sleeping with someone you're not even married to? It appears that Jesus doesn't really want to offend anyone. That's their assumption. But their assumption is wrong. So, in this crowd, you've got 2 groups of people, both with confused theology. How would they understand what God is like? And so Jesus, he tells a series of parables. Now, a parable is just a story Jesus made up. It's completely fictional, and it's meant to help people understand something about God, a truth about God that they're not able to understand. Generally, parables have emotion behind them, so he's trying to, that's what Hollywood does. They put some emotion behind their stories, so we lean in. We're like, ooh, I want to think what they think and believe what they believe. And so Jesus, he uses some emotion here to help people all get on the same page and to teach them something about God that they don't really understand. And what he does is he teaches parables on lost things. You've probably lost things before, haven't you? We all have. We can all relate to that. We've all experienced losing things. And we know that the thing about lost things, the issue with lost things, it's separation. It's separation. And we all know what it's like to be separated from something we care deeply about, especially if we care deeply about it. When we lose things, it's a big deal. And so here's how Jesus addressed this group. He says, suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Now that's a 1% loss, which doesn't really seem like a big deal, does it? It's like going to the store and losing one of your kids, and you got 2 more, and you didn't care about the one who got lost anyway. She wasn't your favorite, or he wasn't your favorite. Just kidding, they're all my favorites, right? Oh, but I mean, 1 sheep in this day was actually significant because they weren't, massive corporate farms where they have tons and tons and tons of sheep. I mean, they knew these sheep by name. They cared deeply for their sheep. So this is a big deal. And so Jesus, he says, doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And perhaps for the first time ever, he's got the Pharisees, he's got the teachers of the law, he's got the sinners, he's got the tax gatherers, all actually agreeing about something. And they're all kind of nodding in agreement, like, yeah, that's what we would do. That's what we would do. We'd go look for that lost sheep until I find it. I'd have a search party. I'd have people helping me. I'd ask people to pray for me that God would help me find that lost sheep. And then when I find it, I'd go and celebrate. And I'd tell other people. And what Jesus says here is, hey, did you know that God celebrates? In fact, did you know that God celebrates over one lost sheep that's found than he does over all the found sheep that were never lost? And then he tells another parable. He tells a parable about coins, which doesn't really mean a whole lot in our society. We don't really value coins, except my children who search Kroger for coins on the ground because we adults are too lazy and we just don't even want to pick them up. That's how useless they are to us. But in this culture, right? I mean, this is a significant coin. It's a coin of great value. And so all of the women in the room, the good women and the bad women, the righteous women and the sinful women, they're like, oh yeah, if I lost a coin, I would turn the house over. I would be searching all over so that I could find this lost coin because I wouldn't be able to sleep because this is so valuable. And all the husbands in the room, I mean, they're kind of nodding. Again, the good husbands, the bad husbands, they can all relate. And here's Jesus' point, that the missing thing has your undivided attention, doesn't it? And you care more about finding what's missing than you care about all the things that aren't missing. Not that you don't care about the things that aren't missing, but your attention, your energy, your focus is directed at that which is missing. And you know this. The more valuable the missing item is, the more desperate the search, and the greater the celebration. When you find that, let's celebrate. Years ago, my dad had given my mom a diamond necklace for their anniversary. And they were out on a date. She was wearing the necklace. They came home. She took the dog out before bed. Somehow the diamond was gone. And man, the time that was spent looking for that diamond out in the grass, out in the yard, the family getting involved. She offered to pay us money if we found this diamond to help motivate us because it was so important to her. She spent more time, more energy, more emotion on that lost diamond than on any of her other jewelry. Not that she didn't value the other jewelry. Jesus says, did you know there's more rejoicing by the angels in heaven over one sinner who comes to repentance than over all those who never needed to repent? And then before anybody can kind of raise a hand and ask a question, Jesus just kind of keeps talking. He says, let me tell you one more parable. And this is the most famous one. There's a dad who has two sons. One son is the older brother. He's the obedient one, just like some of you older brothers or older sisters. Any older ones in the room, you're the behavers. Anyone want to own up to that? Any behavers in the room who did all the right things, who obeyed all the rules? Okay, just a couple, man. The rest of you must be number two, right? Because everything's great until number two comes along, and number two child pushes the boundaries. They're the misbehavior, right? And then if you have a third, that kind of falls to the third child. That's where I was, right? And nobody wants to own up to that. But here's the thing. The older son does everything right. And the younger son basically does everything wrong. And Jesus, because he's making this story up, he can say whatever he wants. And he takes it to this extreme. And he tells this unconscionable story where the son is kind of like decides to go to his dad and say, you know, Dad, I've kind of been waiting for you to die because I just want to get my inheritance. But you're taking a really long time. So could we just pretend that you're dead so that I can go ahead and get my inheritance because I'm tired of waiting around for it? Now, it would be offensive in our world if we went up to a parent and said that. But in this culture that Jesus was speaking into, I mean, it was like so offensive. How could you say something like that? And the crowd, I mean, everybody, they're all on the same page. They're like, oh, how could he do that? And Jesus, again, because he's taking the story to the extreme, basically says, the father says, okay. And he goes and he liquidates a third of his assets because that's what would be coming to that second son. He liquidates it, he gives him the money, and he sends him off. And the son packs his bags, his little fist full of money, and he goes off to some distant country. He goes to Vegas, right? Nobody knows where he's going, what he's doing. It's a terrible, terrible place to go. Nobody knew where he went. And you probably know the story. I mean, he lived it up, right? I mean, he was just living the high life, and it was completely unsustainable. It was what we might describe as reckless living. He didn't care, though. He's having fun. He's doing all the good stuff. It was life without consequences until the consequences. And suddenly his resources ran out. And when his resources ran out, his friends ran out because they were just hanging out for the resources. And so in a few days, don't miss the significance of what Jesus speaks here. And we're going to look at his words here in just a second. But in just a few days, the son squanders what took a lifetime to earn. It is unconscionable. It was senseless waste. And so if you're somebody in the audience listening, even now, I mean, you're in the audience listening. When you think about the emotion attached to that, you know what that emotion is? It's anger. It's anger. I mean, Jesus has everybody in the room angry, and they're just waiting for the karma train to come barreling down the tracks and hit this kid, right? And they're thrilled when Jesus kind of describes that. He's out of money. He's out of a job. He has nowhere to go. He has no friends. And then, worst of all things, there's a famine in the land, and like the bottom drops out, and he just hits this place of rock bottom, and it is terrible. This is karma. And everybody's like, yes, we knew it was coming. We knew it was coming because that's how God works, right? You sow and you reap. And whatever you sowed is what you're going to end up reaping. You sow and you reap. And this kid is getting what he reaped. And you can just imagine the crowd. I mean, they're angry. It's like a self-righteous kind of anger. And you're thrilled to see this kid suffering. And the people are thinking to themselves, you know what? I could go home tonight and tell my kids this story because this will be a great illustration. Kids, you're never going to believe the story I heard today. And this is what happens. And this is what happens. And he has them right where he wants them. And Jesus says this. He says, when he came to his senses, that's the boy who ran off, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. Like, what am I doing here? So he says, I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against you, or I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am owning what I've done. He says, I am no longer worthy. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and he went to his father. Now again, because of our backgrounds, we have some idea generally of where this story is going, but his audience had no idea. Jesus' audience had no idea, and they're thinking in their minds, this is going to be rich. This is going to be so good because when the son goes back, he's going to get what's coming to him. I mean, this kid has embarrassed his family. He's torn the family apart. He's embarrassed his dad and the community. It's such terrible behavior. They knew what they would do if it were their son. And yet the boy's saying, I can't be your son, so could I possibly be your servant? And it's at this point that Jesus makes a very important point that no one would have agreed with at the outset if he hadn't have told all of these stories and gotten us emotionally engaged in what's going on here. If he had started with this, it never would have been heard to begin with. But he says this, he says, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with. And if Jesus pulled the crowd, what was he filled with? What do you think he was filled with? Anger. Of course he's filled with anger. He's humiliated the family. He's humiliated the father. And the father has no idea why the son's returning. He just sees him coming down the road. I mean, this is righteous anger. You are right to have this anger. So he says, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. And he ran to his son, he threw his arms around him, and he kissed him. And in this crowd, there was all kinds of confusion. Like, what kind of story is this? And people understood that when Jesus told parables, generally one person is God and one person is me. I'm either the behavior or the misbehavior. One of them's God. The misbehaviors, they expect judgment, right? Because that's what's coming to me, so I might as well live it up because judgment's coming my way anyway. The behaviors, they expect righteousness, like I deserve good things because I earned it. And yet Jesus, in the embodiment of grace and truth, the fullness of one, both at the expense of neither, he has the entire crowd completely confused. Well, the son, I mean, he starts his speech. This is what he's been planning to do. And so the son said to him, Father, I have sinned. I mean, this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. I sinned. This is sin with a capital S. I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. And no one disagreed with him at this point. They're like, yeah, he is so unworthy. This kid does not deserve this. But that wasn't what mattered. But the father, he said to his servants, quick! Now, we know where this is going, and again, I mean, it's bothersome because we want to say, no, not so quick, not so quick. Because how do we even know this is real? I mean, don't you need to show that this is real for a while? You can't just waltz in here, act like nothing's happened, like life without consequences, and you can come in and you did everything, wrong, but you get treated like you did everything right. Why don't you prove it? Why don't you show me you're sorry? You can stuff your sorries in a sack, mister, because there is nothing. This is like a deathbed confession, isn't it? I'm going to follow Jesus for 5 minutes before I die, and suddenly I'm going to get into heaven. But again, I mean, Jesus is putting words in the mouth of the Father that represent God the Father. He says, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him, put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. You're not going to be my servant, you're my son. And this wasn't it. He goes on, he says, bring the fattened calf and kill it. That calf we've been waiting, and people are like, why are you fattening this thing up? Because we got a celebration. He says, let's have a feast and let's celebrate. This is a big deal. This is a big deal. We have to celebrate. Now, in Sunday school, we kind of end the story here, don't we? If you grew up in church, you know that. I mean, Sunday school, this is where the story ends. And kids, you can always come back to Jesus. Yeah, that's a good thing. But this is not the end of the story. There were two sons, remember? There was a behavior and a misbehavior. And so you can just imagine what the behaving son was doing. He's out in the fields doing what? Behaving. He's doing everything he was supposed to do. He's working the fields. He's doing his father's bidding. He's trying to make his dad happy. He's been doing the chores. He's been doing all the stuff. And he sees this party tent going up and the bouncy castle. And he sees the people from town riding their camels in. And they're like, oh, there's a party for me, right? And so he's so excited, and he goes and he asks the servant, what's going on here? I see there's a party going on. And the servant's like, oh yeah, your brother came home and your dad's throwing a party to celebrate. And you can like see the color removed from his face. He's what? He's what? Oh yeah, aren't you excited? No. Would you be excited? What would you be? Angry. Angry. And the crowd, once again, Jesus has them all on the same playing field. The crowd agrees. And Jesus tells them what the older brother's thinking. He says, the older brother became angry and he refused to go in. I just want to mess with you just for a minute here. Have you ever met an angry Christian before? Were you ever schooled by an angry nun? There's Catholics in the room. Did you ever have an angry pastor or an angry preacher, angry Christian parent? Did you ever leave church because the people there just seemed angry and disputatious? And it's almost like they believe in hell because they're really hoping somebody goes there. You know, because they're doing all the stuff, they're doing all the good things, and they're thinking, somebody else deserves this, and I can't wait till they get it, because they get to have all the fun, and I'm doing all the work, and I want those fun people to spend eternity in hell. That's what Jesus is painting a picture of here. You've got two brothers, one who's madder than a wet hornet. He doesn't want to go to the party. He's just ticked off. There's another brother who doesn't believe he deserves to go to the party. Remember, he said, I've sinned, and not just against heaven, against God, against you, Dad. And then you've got this father, and you've got this confused audience, maybe a little confused like we are, like, Jesus, where are you going with this story? Well, word got to the father that the older son was just really ticked off. So Jesus says, his father went out and pleaded with him. Look, I know you're angry. I know you're upset. Please come, please come, please come. He wanted nothing to do with it. So Jesus answered, but he looked at his father. Look, all these years I have been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. I won't ask you to raise your hands if you can relate to that. There's a chance you're an angry Christian. And the reason you're angry is because you have been slaving for God, waiting for God to do something for you. You're not disobeying his orders, and you deserve, at least you think you deserve, what everybody else seems to get. You've been faithful to your spouse. They weren't faithful. You disciplined your kids during those hard years. They didn't discipline their kids. You were generous when money was tight. They're not generous. You served when they're not serving. You saved yourself from marriage. They didn't. And what's so fascinating, don't miss this. This is the depiction Jesus gives us. The holier you feel, the angrier you become. You know why? Because you're not grace. You're not grace. And you hear about good things happening to people who are bad people. What the heck? There was a hot place for them someday. I'm just holding on to that. And this is the thing you need to know. You can be angry, and you can be an angry, self-righteous Christian. You can found political movements on it if you want. But you can't be a disciple. You can't actually follow Jesus and be like Jesus and be that way. So the son answered the father. He says, look, all these years I've been slaving for you. I've never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. What about me? Where's my reward for being good? He continues on. He says, but this son of yours who has squandered, just wasted your property with prostitutes. Like, don't tell mom, the prostitutes. Oh my goodness. And he comes home and you kill the fattened calf for him. This is ridiculous. This is unjust. And so the father responds, and what he says, it is so unexpected, it is so unusual. And my friends, it is so easy to gloss over, but do not miss this. He says, my son, you are always with me. What do you mean with? What does that mean? Son, you're always in my company. Well, we're not talking about being with, we're talking about the injustice of this whole situation. Yeah, I know what we're talking about, son. It's about with. It's about with. With me is what I value. You've always been with me. And then he says this, he says, and everything I have is yours, meaning I'm not going to split up the estate again. He's not getting another share of inheritance. There's no second inheritance. I have not forgotten that. But you're with me. And then he goes on, he says, we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead. He wasn't with me. And he's alive again. He's with me. He's lost. He wasn't with me. But now he's found. He's back. See, this isn't about performance. This is about proximity. And the father says to the older brother, look, you've always been near me. And he hasn't. This party that we're throwing, it's not because he's somehow performed. It's because he's finally near. I wanted him near. And now he's back. And what's so fascinating when Jesus tells this parable, there's no application. He doesn't say, and this is what I meant by that. He just kind of finishes. He paints a picture for us to all lean into of this uncomfortable reality. Perhaps the biggest difference between just being a Christian and being a disciple. It's the belief that God could not love you more and nothing you will do could ever make him love you less. But it's not just you and it's not just me, it's the you next to you. It's the you who offends you. It's the you who offends your children. The people you care deeply about who have been hurt, the ones who hurt the ones you love. All of those, right? The Apostle John talked about how God's great love was given to all of us, for God so loved the world. For all the younger brothers in the room and for all of the older ones. God could not love you more, and there's nothing you can do to make him love you less. God doesn't get mad at lost things. In fact, have you ever lost like the TV remote? That's one that happens all the time in our house. We don't even watch that much TV, but when I do, I want the remote to be where I can find it. I don't get mad at the remote. Do you know what I get mad at? The little people. It's the little people moving the remote around. I'm like, can't you put it back? Can't you put my tools back? I don't care if you use them, but put them back. I'm not mad at the tool. I'm mad at the person. Man, when you get angry because somebody comes back, Jesus looks at you and says, it's just self-righteousness. It's just self-righteousness. When you're angry at another person, it's self-righteousness. You somehow think that you've earned it. Jesus says the issue isn't earning it. This is important. The issue with God, listen, the issue with God isn't performance and obedience. The issue is with. And when you understand the heart of the Father, you begin to understand how important it is to be with him. And the thing about God is that sin breaks his heart because it keeps you from being with. Sin gets in the way of us being with. It's not ultimately about performance and obedience. Obedience will lead us to being with. But what God cares deeply about is being with you. Which means that sin, whether your own sin or my sin or anybody else's sin, should break our hearts. It should not make us angry. It should lead us to the point of compassion. Because remember, the Father was filled with what? Compassion when he saw the Son coming. Everyone else is filled with righteous anger, self-righteous anger. Not the Father. He was filled with compassion. It was grace and truth. Because he understood the importance of being with. And so Jesus, he speaks to all of us. He says, look, God couldn't love you more. There's nothing you can do to make God love you less. Sin will always break his heart, and repentance will always stir his heart. Repentance will always stir his heart because he cares so deeply for you. That's why we get so excited when we celebrate baptisms. That's why we cheer, we yell, we scream. We should be crazy excited Because somebody who was not with God is now with God. That's the invitation for every single one of us. And before we close, I just want to say one thing to any of you who may be a prodigal in the room. Maybe you felt a little bit of a tug on your own heart and your own life as you've thought about whether or not you are with God. I just want you to know God is looking at you and he's saying, I want you back. I want you back. I want you back. I want you to be with me. And the thing he understands is that sin decays things. That's why he hates it so much. Sin decays things. Sin kills things. It kills our relationships. It kills our self-images. It kills us. And the reason I can say that with confidence is because I know sin has killed things inside of me. I can look at periods of my life where you're thinking, oh, it's not a big deal, it won't impact me, but it does, and you carry it with it for the rest of your life. And God says, I don't want that for you. I love you so much. God isn't mad at you. He's brokenhearted, and he wants you back. So maybe you need to go call somebody, say you're sorry. Maybe you need to move back home, tell your parents you're sorry. Maybe you need to go to work and clean up a mess you created there. Maybe you need to pack your bags and move out because you moved in together and you weren't married and there was something inside of you said, I don't know if this is right, but I'm going to do it anyway. Whatever it is, I just want you to know, God is not mad. He is brokenhearted. He wants you back home. For all of us, if we're going to be disciples, we have to be grace and truth, grace and truth, grace and truth. If we're to be a church that is like Jesus, we have to be grace and truth, grace and truth. The embodiment of both at the expense of neither. Let me pray for us. Heavenly Father, what a beautiful account Jesus taught us. What a masterful teacher he was. And Father, I know my own life. I know how easy it is to fall into the older brother, to be angry because I've been self-righteous. I've been good. I've done the right things. For others, it's easy to fall into the younger brother, thinking we can never be good enough. We can never be good enough. Father, would you help all of us to know that you just want us to be with you? God, for the prodigals in the room who have wandered away from you, would you give them courage to come be with you? For those watching online who are prodigals, would you give them the courage to be with you, to make a step in your direction? Thank you for the compassion with which you embrace us, just as you embraced the younger son in that parable. God, give each one of us wisdom to know what we need to do with what we've heard today. Give us courage to do it. And would we experience being with you? I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.